This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Monday, July 13th, 2026. It's good to be back. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio and doing a quick podcast without makeup, really. It's kind of fashionable. And obviously dressed for the summer heat. It's been beautiful here. Today's been like a fabulous day. And I got up early and took my dog to the Portland Headlight, which is located in Cape Elizabeth. It's the most photographed lighthouse, I think, ever in the history of the world. And it's right here in my small hometown. And so my day started out just fabulous. Then I was driving out to the jail to meet with my female clients who are housed with trans identified so-called men who harass and assault them. And I represent a group of women who are suing the Maine Correctional Center, the warden, as well as the commissioner, and one of the assailants, Andrew Balser, who goes by Andrea. He goes by Andrea as he sexually harasses his, roommates who are females. He's still an intact male in jail for killing his parents and his dog. But he gets to house with the women because he identifies as female. So I'm on my way to the jail to represent these women who are alleging that their rights to be free from cruel and unusual punishment are being violated. Their Eighth Amendment constitutional rights, as well as their rights under the First Amendment, freedom of religion, freedom to be free from state imposed religion like gender ideology, freedom of speech. They've got a lot of claims, a lot of good claims. And some people can't believe that it's actually the case that there are violent men who are housed with women in the Maine Correctional Center. I tell people, and they're like, no way, it can't be that bad. It's like, it is. It really is that bad. So I'm on my way and I happen to turn on the radio. I used to listen to NPR all the time. Now, not every second, but this morning I turned it on. I like Michelle Martin. In fact, I think she's my number one NPR host. And as soon as I turned the radio on, it was the beginning of an interview by Michelle Martin. And the guest was Shenna Bellows, the Maine Secretary of State, who's now running for the United States Senate. She had just been a candidate in the Democratic primary for governor here in Maine, and through ranked choice voting process, got booted out. Hannah Pingree is the Democratic candidate for governor. So Shenna Bellows is finishing up, her term, but she could be reelected as Secretary of State in Maine. The legislature actually elects the constitutional officers that include the Secretary of State. So it's not a statewide office, but she's being interviewed by Michelle Martin, and first of all, she's sickly sweet, like disgusting campaign mode, almost slow motion. How thoughtful she's been about this unbelievably quick pivot from I'm running for governor to now I'm running for U.S. Senate, and it just it just galled me because she basically had 3 points to make, and it took her a long time to make them points. But she's basically the woman angle, right, and for democracy, and I forget what the third one was. Oh, and because of these great progressive policies, the Platner platform, she wants to be the standard bearer. So first of all, okay, let's talk about Graham Platner. Remember him? He was the superstar candidate that was like birthed from these weird DC consultants. The guy with the beard was a Daniel Maraff. Is that the guy's name? With this really squeaky voice. He and his girlfriend. Okay, this guy actually got his fiancée a necklace that contained a locket, and in the locket was a little brush for the fiancée to use on this guy, Dan's beard. Really a weird guy. And they're the ones that recruited Graham Platner. And Graham Platner, of course, we all know, had this trajectory that was going off the charts. It was almost like the stock market, even. And, this brand was created. It caught on fire. I think he was on like the covers of, various magazines and making all the rounds on television. Just captivating Maine Democrats, just absolutely captured by this guy. And of course, he's radiating toxic masculinity and like bravado and all kinds of red flags the whole time for anyone who's paying attention, right? Anyone who's paying attention knows that if you have a guy who has a Nazi tattoo that he claims to not know about, uh, that's a pretty big red flag right there. And this is a guy who signed up twice to fight for wars and now says he's so opposed to them and blames Senator Collins. He's 100% disabled. Credible, accusations and allegations made by women that he like assaulted them, harassed them, tormented them. All of it there in broad daylight. But it wasn't until just recently when a Democratic, I guess, uh, woman, spilled again her story to a news media that had the courage to report it, unlike the New York Times. Well, then, of course, Graham Platner's toxic, and everybody backs away from him, and everybody backs away from him, including Shenna Bellows, right? Shenna Bellows, who is like arm in arm with Graham Platner, who voted for him, right? If she voted for Graham Platner in the gubernatorial primary, I assume, since she's the progressive and he is the progressive. So she votes for this guy, she pals around with him, campaigns him around the state. Finally, the winds turn, right? And she's, has aspirations. So she dumps him, but then she's now running for his spot, allegedly wanting to press his issues when hello, like so you didn't have the sense that he was toxic and that you shouldn't have voted for him, and now you want to run against Susan Collins because you want to fight Trump. Well, at least Susan Collins had the good sense not to vote for Trump. Okay, Shenna Bellows voted for Graham Platner. Susan Collins didn't vote for Trump. And then to for her to somehow fall on her laurels about being like she's doing it because she's a woman and she cares about women's rights. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. She is largely responsible for the erosion of women's rights and kids' rights in the state of Maine. When she was a state senator, she ushered in gender identity that essentially erases protections on the basis of sex. She was all in on gender identity. In fact, that she sponsored a bill, an act to bring gender parity to corporate boards. No, she testified in support of a bill in her position as Secretary of State. She actually said, I'm the first female Secretary of State who's like, testify. Oh, I guess who's testifying about the subject matter, maybe. Uh, Maybe she is the first female Secretary of State. So she mentioned the fact that the first female. But what's ironic and what just like galled me, like I said, was in that bill that she supported so strongly, they actually define female to mean an individual who self identifies as a woman without regard to the individual's designated sex at birth. So actually changed the definition of female. So the whole purpose of this bill is to bring gender parity to corporate boards, but it could actually be a corporate board that's all men. It's just that as long as half of them self-identify as female. I mean, just talk about the erosion of women's rights. I mean, if you define female to mean male, you are not a proponent of women's rights. Sorry. So, the women's rights thing just like and and so not only gender ID, which wipes out, sex-based rights and these really radical bills redefining female. We have bills in Maine statutes, excuse me, we have laws on the books in Maine that accept the scientific, definition of female in so many instances. It's only since this gender identity nonsense got snuck in 2019 and now has been built upon and built upon by people like Shenna Bellows are we questioning, some basic simple definitions like female, but according to a law that Secretary of State Shenna Bellows supported as Secretary of State, female means men. And uh and then let's just think about democracy in women. She said like her three planks, of her platform are women, democracy, and then her policies. Okay, so women in democracy, as Secretary of State, she just took action that disenfranchises over 70,000 Maine people who signed a petition to put forth on the ballot in November proposed legislation that would separate school sports and private spaces on the basis of sex, on the basis of biological sex, sex, male and female. And the reason why we have to do this is because Shenna Bellows in 2019 and the years thereafter was part of this group that just shoved gender identity into every nook and cranny of the law, and it essentially allows men to access female spaces and play on female teams whenever they say so. So this idea that somehow there's been this anti-trans wave, no, no, no. It's been people playing defense because it snuck up on us. All of a sudden, we have these crazy laws that say, you know, the definition of female includes men. It it it's crazy. So Shenna Bellows disenfranchised 70,000 people who signed petition to put legislation on the ballot that would separate sports on the basis of biological sex. And that's about democracy. So she not only disenfranchised the people who wanted to vote on this, but she clearly doesn't care about the rights of women and girls. You know, women whose rights have been totally undermined, right? The rights that we fought for hundreds of years now suddenly are gone because of people like Shenna Bellows who just can't think for themselves. They accept hook, line, and sinker the gender ideology from these people who they think are the big poobahs on gender. Like, look at Glad Law, Mary Bonato, Chase Stragio, like all these big rock stars. Well, I'm sorry, they have it wrong. They have it wrong, wrong, wrong. And the Democrats are wrong about this issue. And Shenna Bellows is wrong to assume that separating sports and private spaces on the basis of sex somehow hurts anyone. It doesn't. It's separating people on a scientific category for very legitimate purposes. And it's fair because all people play by the same rules. It's not banning trans anybody from anything. Because if you're a trans boy, in other words, if you're a girl who identifies as a boy, then you play on the girls' team. Doesn't matter if you're trans. If you're a girl, biologically female, you play on the girls' team. You can still identify as a boy. Identify to your heart's content. Same thing with the boys who identify as female. Well, you know, identify your little hearts out. But you play on the boys' team, and that's fair and it's safe. And there's nothing bigoted about it. And yet Shenna Bellows doesn't want to put that legislation out because she's for democracy. And yet she also tried to disenfranchise like what half of the state who voted for Donald Trump. I mean, she is the Secretary of State. The second congressional district in Maine, they voted for Trump. He got an electoral vote. Okay, so that's not nothing. That means that half of the state voted for, Donald Trump. So to just try to get him off the ballot so they can't vote for him again is um isn't really about democracy in my view. So uh preceding Shenna's talk on the radio was Senate President Maddie Daughtry, who also, she gets on the radio and says, she had been, like, I think, attached at the hip to Graham Platner, right? Everybody was riding on his wagon when things were going up, right? But then when the star crashed, uh, you know, it's like rats leaving a ship. And Maddie Daughtry on the radio today says, well, it wasn't about the person Platner, that rogue who I sucked up to. No, it wasn't about him. It was about his ideas and his, the movement, the progressive movement, right? And I'm listening, and she says, I got involved. This is the Senate president. Okay, she's the president of the Maine Senate, and she said when she got involved in politics, I think it was 8 years ago. I think she was 25 years old and she couldn't afford an apartment and she was like working 4 jobs and she was just so frustrated at the system. She wanted to stick it to the man and do something about that to make life affordable and better for working class people. So she says now, right? She's the Senate president. She says, and that's what I'm still, I still am all about that. That's my still, mantra. Okay, well, you were in charge for 8 years as a Democrat in a democratically controlled legislature with a Democratic governor, and you had oodles of money. You could have put in place every policy you wanted, and you did. And you have nothing to show for it, except I'm sorry, but the Senate President, Matty Daughtry, who I like a lot, I like the Senate President. I have a lot of respect for her, but I do think it's a little weird that she got that big, huge loan. So here she is, the Senate President. She gets this giant loan from a state agency. And like the legislation includes, under her watch that she gave herself a raise. So, don't tell me that you're still mad about the fact that 25-year-olds can't like earn a living and afford housing when you have had 8 years, a lot of money to make changes, and there's nothing really to show for it. We'll see if this paid family leave, you know, does actually help people. I'm not sure, but Maddie Daughtry, again, t- as a Democrat, as a woman, you you've got work to do in your caucus to convince members that they don't need to abide by, be the handmaidens for special interest groups, especially what I call the Alphabet Club. And you know who I'm talking about. The special interest groups that have been pushing this gender ideology hand in hand with all the other social cultural issues, but especially gender ideology, gender affirming care for kids. Oh my goodness. Okay, our statutes now actually cite WPATHS, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, that is under investigation, that has been largely shamed and debunked as like, quackery because it is. Well, that's the standards that are used in the Maine statute to enable minors to access this so-called gender affirming care. This is the kind of legislation that happened on the watch of the Democrats. Okay, legislation actually erasing the word women, defining female to include men, right? Giving kids a license to butcher themselves, body modification, right? Oh no, because it's all about, I guess, accepting gender nonconformity. So we're gonna give like drugs and surgery to kids who are have angst about their gender. It's um, the Democratic Party needs to get back to square one and recognize the reality of women. Okay, the Democrats have abandoned the very sacred cause of protecting the rights of women and girls and protecting the rights of children. Their embrace of gender ideology, okay, without any thought to the implications on women and girls and kids. They're under this orthodoxy that we have to accept. It's crazy. And wouldn't it be ironic? This is how I'm going to close the show. These Democrats who are, railing about, how they're going to pick up the mantle of the Platner uh, campaign and all the great policies. I can't think of one that has worked. Okay, show me a progressive policy that has actually produced results in the state of Maine. I can't think of one. I just can't. Okay, the educational programs in the okay, the Department of Corrections, they're all in on language. They don't call inmates anymore inmates, they call them residents. Yeah, so they call inmates residents and they call men women. Okay, I guess that's progress. So now we don't have accurate records about who's housed with whom and who's male and who's female, because if someone identifies as female, then the guards and the staff and the inmates have to respect that and affirm that. So the parties, they need to get back to their mission of protecting women's rights. And it wouldn't be ironic if the Supreme Court's recent decision that enables parties to spend, and to coordinate spending with candidates, to lift the caps and the limits that have otherwise shackled these political parties that have basically sucked out their power and given it all to these special interest groups that largely are funded by dark money, right? I mean, it's just like it's gross kind of money laundering for nonprofits. They create these education, whatever, these entities that are allowed to essentially collect contributions that the donors can write them off. They can keep their identity anonymous. The money goes to the special interest organization like Glad Law, for instance, Planned Parenthood. They do the bidding of the donors. I mean, it's just a special interest group. It's like the NRA. I mean, I that's how it's to me. It's the alphabet club: NRA, Glad Law, ACLU, actually Planned Parenthood, um, certainly Equality Maine. All these organizations, they band together at the state house. They scratch one another's backs. They push through an agenda that includes all these, just priorities of these small special interest groups. And in this case, it's activists. It's the next wave of the gender ideologues. They're not set to just accept marriage equality, which is what a majority of the population of America accepts and embraces. No, they have to forge ahead with this very, 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 very narrow interest, which really there's no stories behind it. It's just a next cause that can generate additional fighters and cash for these groups. They're always looking for a cause, always wanting to build their coalition. It's about power. It's about political power. And it's going to fall on the shoulders of a lot of our gay and lesbian and bisexual friends to cut the cord with the TQIA. That there's really it's not a we. Don't let the Chase Strangios think that because you're gay that you have so much in common with trans activists because you don't really. I mean, unless you're willing to believe whatever political consulting, special interest group tells you you are. If you're going to accept that, then whatever. But if you think closely about it, if you think more, I think analytically about it, isn't being gay about who you love, right? Isn't that what the LGB is about? Lesbian, gay, bi, like it's about who you love. And that's what marriage equality is about, who you love. And the trans is not about who you love. The trans is a disassociation between body and soul, and it's trying to be normalized by people who are trans activists. For a long time, it was accepted if you had gender dysphoria and you were trans, well, you were certainly deserving of compassion and a reasonable accommodation. But the activists had to push for gender identity laws that now allow any man with any kind of weird sexual fetish to claim that they identify as a woman and prance around in woman face, and we're supposed to accept it as protesting and drag queens and engage in all this really inappropriate behavior and say that they're identifying as a woman, so we have to affirm it. Bad, bad, bad news. Anyway, that's enough. Till next time, this is Cynthia Dill signing off. Take care. Oops, my outro.